Welcome to the panel. It's such a privilege that we have, I think, of focusing on gender-based violence, an issue that, a problem whose visibility has increased so dramatically in recent years. The early commitment to recognizing it and to collecting data on it has really paid off. And now we are able to shift the emphasis from making this problem visible to focusing more on measuring its impact obviously it's a great violation of human rights, but its impact on health and economic growth and justice. And also we're able to shift our attention to the kinds of things, the actions that can be taken to address the problem. In keeping with the very positive and upbeat tone of the Clinton Global Initiative, I think it's interesting to think about this enormous social injustice, really a social wound in a way, around which people are really motivated to come together and find ways to heal and to find ways to make things different going forward. So we've heard about the many different expressions of gender-based violence. The WHO data that 1 in 3 women experience physical or sexual assault. We also heard reference to child, early, and forced marriage, FGM and C, and other forms of violence. And there are many expressions of gender-based violence because it reflects the broad social realities of this is not a private issue, that it's a social problem, that it's a question of values, of social and cultural values that people have, and that have massive social and economic impacts. And so obviously it's very necessary to think really big about a big problem like this. There are many interesting ways to prevent and mitigate and respond to gender-based violence. And I just wanted to mention 5 really interesting strategies that were mentioned in a recent review by Lori Heisey. The need to transform gender-related norms of masculinity, to reduce exposure to violence in childhood, and Gary Cohen touched on the implications of exposure and how it translates into perpetration later in life, particularly for boys. Addressing male alcohol abuse, increasing women's economic empowerment, and ensuring a supportive legal and justice system. So our panelists come from very different perspectives and have a lot to share about their experiences. I'm going to start with a question for Beatriz. The Coca-Cola company has spent a lot of time and money investing in empowering women, women-owned business throughout its supply chain. Why has this been a focus of the company, and what does the company hope to accomplish through that focus?
Sure, and first I'll start by tagging on to some of the conversation here today. Across all of our business, we've adopted the women's empowerment principles, and so we feel that that's really important to not just look at it in specific targeted programs, but across everything you do and across your entire value chain and all the impacts your business will have. Very specifically, though, we set a program to empower 5 million women by 2020, and we did that because we know that if you look at our business, we are sourcing from farmers for some of our ingredients, all the way through to think about the recyclers who are helping to clean up their communities and trying to earn a living and doing those things. And so when Muhtar Khan a couple years ago, actually the Clinton Global Initiative stood on stage and made this commitment, I'll be honest, we didn't necessarily have the roadmap completely planned out, but he quickly assembled the team and said, we need to be aggressive, we need to be bold, and now we need partners to make it happen. And there are many people in this room who have helped us start to expand on that journey. Today, I'm proud to say we're at 865,000 women. We validate our numbers through PwC. It's across 52 countries. We have partners like the Inter-American Development Bank sitting right here, so thank you. I know Rohini's been in many of our discussions as well as another partner. And we found that it's a heavy lift, but the most important thing is starting by removing some of the barriers. And the barriers we all heard a little bit about today is we can go in, and one size doesn't fit all, but say we go into a country like India, and we want to work with a woman who's running her shop there to help her have business skills, tools, or give her a solar-powered cooler. We recognize that we actually first have to sit down and have a conversation with the community leaders and the men. And we have to engage them equally. And because we're a corporation, we're not necessarily skilled in doing that ourselves, so we rely on partners who are on the ground, our employees who are working in the community, and we bring together civil society, government, other businesses, and NGOs to help us drive that true impact and ensure that the program we have from India to South Africa to Egypt to right here in the United States is looking at what are those social issues and barriers that need to be removed first, and then putting the programs in place that are relevant to those key individuals. And it's important to us because at the end of the day, Coca-Cola's decision maker, it's women. So quick historical note, in 1934, Robert Woodruff, who was one of our founding fathers, put the first female ever on a corporate board of directors. Her name was Letty Pate Evans, and she joined the Coca-Cola board. He did that because he said, how can we sell our products if we don't have a woman's perspective? We'll never be successful. And since that time, we've always had a woman on our corporate board of directors. Today, Muhtar Kent has 4 on our board of directors. And it's something that is critical to our business because we know that not only do women make decisions for our business, at the same time, they're the ones who, when they're empowered, they're reinvesting in their communities and they're driving social change. Thank you.
Luis Alberto, I was hoping that you would tell us what the Inter-American Development Bank is doing to combat violence and violence against women, and what is it to you? Why does the IDB care about this issue?
Well, first of all, the issue of women, and I think the previous panel explained it very well. I mean, the numbers of what this means in pure economic terms are overwhelming. The data is there. It's been tested over and over again. So if your mission is about economic development and eliminating poverty, you cannot take a pass at this issue. Now, what do we do? I mean, certainly as a development bank, the majority of our work is about empowering women through a variety of ways around entrepreneurship, from microfinance, through creating increasingly more and more possibilities for hundreds of women to have access to finance, and equally through mentoring programs, through internships, so in all of that space. And I have to say that, in this area, even though one thinks you're doing a lot, there's still a huge vacuum to fill. But I believe that when one looks at this issue in Latin America, I think the research from McKinsey is very interesting, and something that Gary mentioned as well. The number one issue in Latin America today is not jobs, it's security. But if you go to the basic roots of security problems, they begin by observing children at the very early ages when they're, even we do this today in our programs of early childhood. Because a child that sees any form of violence will then go out and reproduce that form of violence. And this is a fundamental subject that is, I'm glad that Gary raised it, because certainly in a region like ours, where security and violence are so important, this is the single most important issue. And so this whole question of, I always say that in Latin America we have this paradox, we have 40% of Latin Americans governed by women, when 25 years ago we were military governments. So, we're exporting that possibility. Some countries still need to adapt it. And then, on the other hand, the other reality is that is what I would call the cultural issues, which is what happens behind closed doors. It is accepted in some countries, violence against women because they didn't serve the dinner on time, because they didn't take the children or this. I mean, these things need to change by demonstration. So let me give you a few examples of things that I've seen that have really been game changers. In my own country, in Colombia, soccer is a big deal in Latin America. The coach of the Colombian soccer team abused his wife coming out of a bar, and it became a huge story that went viral. And the country was troubled. Oh my goodness, what do we do without the coach? the president came out and said, you got to get rid of the coach. Not only was the best decision for women empowerment and to make a case against violence against women, but it was the best thing that happened to the soccer team because we could brought an Argentinian coach and we did very well in the World Cup. But let me give you other examples. Because I think it's very important to look at ways that these things are changing. In the case of Brazil, which is a continental country in our region, 200 plus million people, President Lula, when he was president, decided that in the metro system, the first 2 trains would be exclusively for women to protect them, and created equally police that could in turn help women go to their places of work, etc., back and forth to their homes. So we have a case and a number of things that we're doing. One that impacted this country a lot, and that is when all these children came back a year and a half ago from Central America, largely what's called the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, there were thousands of children coming. And they were coming certainly because they see violence, but more importantly, they were coming to meet up the rest of the family that was probably here. But it was a part of this was coming from the violence that they were seeing at home, and certainly the lack of economic opportunity. So we've now put a program together that was asked by these 3 presidents of these 3 countries, and we're actually working on a program precisely to address this set of issues. Or for instance, something that was tried in South Africa, which is to connect microfinance to sexual violence by a partner. So I know I'm going too long, so I'll stop there, but these are the kinds of things that one has to do a lot by example, a lot by testing, and I just would say today big data gives us an opportunity we did not have before. Something Ashley said that is extremely important. Governments produce hundreds of data sets that are vertical data sets. But the horizontal capability that one can achieve through big data and mining that data will provide ways for us to measure the impact in ways that we haven't seen before. And that requires an organization inside an institution to be able to deliver that, and I'll shut up there. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd love to come back to your theme about sort of the cultural factors. But I'd like to pass to you, Tulika, and working much closer to the ground, and ask you to talk a little bit about the mission of the South Asia Women's Fund and why it was founded and what you're doing.
Thank you, Margaret. Before I talk about South Asia Women's Fund, I just want to also talk about all the women funds in the world that are doing such a fabulous job and are working at with very small funds to support a very large group of women's rights work, a very large range of women's rights work, and with the expertise and the technical heart, I always call it the technical heart, that is not possible for larger owners and larger funders who are so far away to do. So I really want to acknowledge the International Network of Women's Funds and the work they do all over the world. And the role of women's funds, and that's, I think, the core mission of South Asia Women's Funds. We have to recognize at the moment that women's rights work is hugely underfunded. It is hugely subsidized by women's groups who are working on budgets of $5,000, maybe. Actually, the national mid-level groups are working on $20,000. These are big groups. And the smaller groups are like barely surviving and undertaking work for which there is literally no recognition for the kind of effort that goes into it. So South Asia Women's Fund's major mission is to make sure that there are resources on the table, not only from the global community, but also from the local communities, and they are directed towards women's rights work. That is our calling. That is what we do. And the second piece of work that we do is to bring to the table the marginalized voices, voices that are not heard, voices of women who identify as sex workers, women that identify as domestic workers, women who undertake transactional sex work but don't call themselves sex workers. Voices that need to be heard and not criminalized. Voices that need to be brought to center stage and to be heard as solution makers. And I think that is the very mission of South Asian Women. I just wanted to make these 3 points to begin with.
Thank you. And Rohini, I'd like to give you the chance to talk a little bit about how Sodexo is working to address violence against women throughout the supply chain and throughout its work.
Sure, thank you so much. It's been a really interesting conversation, and my mind is already working in multiple directions. I think, clearly we know that gender-based violence is both the cause and the consequence of gender inequality. And we need to do some heavy lifting across the public and private sector systemically if we're going to come up with solutions. And at Sodexo, I would say, we are the 18th largest employer in the world. We have 420,000 employees in over 80 countries. And clearly, something as pervasive as gender-based violence impacts our own employees and impacts the communities in which we work. So we're focused in 3 key areas. The first is around empowerment of women in the supply chain, and we made a commitment last year at CGI to spend $1 billion with 5,000 SMEs, 1,500 of them women-owned and operated, and many of your organizations in this room are partnering with us, helping us to meet those goals. We've also been focused on empowering women in the community, giving them economic opportunities, which provides them with those alternatives in order to be independent and to break out of the cycle of violence. And I'll share an example there. And then the third one is amongst our own employees, because I think there, again, we have to both provide the education and the awareness for both men and women so that they can break the cycle of violence and change the norms, both in the workplace as well as in the community. And I thought it was an interesting comment that was made around why this is not more overt in corporate America. I think it needs to be, and I think some of it does have to do with destigmatization. Some of it has to do with providing that language to have the conversation in a safe way. But we're beginning to do that in pockets. And just to give you an example there, in Latin America, particularly in Chile, Brazil, and in Colombia, we've just started a campaign for our employees and in the community where we're educating our employees, and we're making this a focus of International Women's Day to do a LATAM-wide campaign against violence against women, which we hope to measure the outcomes of that and see if we can make a dent in that space. In the empowerment of women in the supply chain, we actually have an opportunity to impact not just our supply chain and our employees, but also our client organizations and their supply chains. So, for instance, in Peru, we provide services in a very remote part of the Andes for a client organization, a mining company. And this mining company is 4,300 meters above sea level. It's 200 kilometers from the closest city in a very poor area, high rates of violence against women, no infrastructure. And what we've done there is we put in place a training program, and this does, we've been talking about win-win. These solutions do have to be win-win solutions. So a training program where we've trained over 1,500 people, 800 of whom we've employed, and about 49% of those are women. But it's given these women an opportunity to, in many instances, break out of that cycle of violence. Some of them have joined our supply chain. They provide us with products like cheese. Others we've directly employed. And others have gone on to actually open businesses of their own. So, the case of Marcela, she actually learned from some of our chefs, went on to create a quinoa recipe, went on to win a national competition, and with the money that she received, she actually opened a restaurant and is now employing people who are being trained by Sodexo. So these are women who are joining us, but also are beginning and starting their own businesses. In terms of empowering women in the community to combat violence, one example is in Chennai, where we have partnered with an NGO called Eco Kitchen. And this is an 18,000 square foot facility, which is a green facility with natural light and ventilation, wastewater treatment plant, etc. And we work with Eco Kitchen to basically provide women who've been victims of domestic violence with the resources. So it's a micro-entrepreneurship program. We provide them training, we give them food carts, and they go out and learn how to be street vendors. We tell them, inform them as to where they can actually have their street carts and become street vendors. And it's just, there's a story of one woman who actually was, when I met her, she had third-degree burns on her face, most, incredibly sparkly eyes. She had basically been abused by her husband and her in-laws because she hadn't brought enough dowry to her with her. And when she gave birth to twin girls, they tried to kill her by dousing her with kerosene and setting her on fire. She escaped, and through a social worker, reached Eco Kitchen, and now today she is, independent. She has a place of her own with her 2 daughters, and every day she comes and gives them money for the next day's orders, takes that cart, and certainly it's empowering her. And the example that I wanted to share about Colombia, we're actually working with the mayor of Medellin and with FARC, with those that have been victims of violence themselves. 30% of those that we've been working with are actually women, and we've provided them with training and skills. So it's a 6-month program that we have in Colombia where we've trained about 300 people, 30% of them are women, and many of these women have been themselves victims of abuse and violence. So.
Well, you've each of you has highlighted some very important themes and emphasized both the deep roots of some of these issues and the necessity of addressing them from many different angles. Unfortunately, we're very constrained for time, and my understanding is that we now need to open up for questions and answers from the audience, and so let's do that.
Hi, thank you very much. I had a question because I was very impressed with the idea of having a woman on the board, because a product can't sell its products perhaps as effectively in the market without a woman's perspective. So when we talk about the impact of global-based violence on the economy and women's loss of earnings, what about the loss to the economy when women can't be effective consumers? And is anyone trying to capture that data? And then also I was thinking about men, when they, it's very well known that a woman who is financially empowered will plow 90% of every dollar, 90 cents, into the family. Men, it's about 35 cents. What are they doing with the other 65? They're buying sex, tobacco, and alcohol. If they weren't buying exploitative sex, how much money would they be plowing effectively into the economy? Is anyone looking at that? We mentioned alcohol and drugs in the opening, didn't get to that. Would love to hear your thoughts, both when men and boys use and as well as women. Is anyone looking at the 12-step model? It's free, it's behavior change communication, it's peer-to-peer. There was a woman in Congo employed by Women for Women International, and every year around the anniversary of when she was taken sex slave, she'd go on an alcoholic binge. Lost to her family, lost to herself. I told her about AA and connected her with Alcoholics Anonymous in Wanda. And then the role of narrative and voice, love what Gary said about the children debriefing without an adult present. And the data is so important. And one of the things I want to encourage all of us to do, the rest of CGI, is to use the narrative, because it's the story that actually changes the brain and changes the, and catalyzes the behavior. Thanks.
Well, I will give you a couple of examples on the many things that you just touched upon, Ashley. In terms of what governments can do, some of these behavioral changes go by, for instance, in El Salvador, we developed a center that is now being copied in a number of countries throughout Central America and in South America, where we call, or is called, a City of Women. And what it happens there is that a woman that is abused comes in, and all the government agencies that have to do with that, that happens, the judge, the police, etc., are there, present, all the way to the place where they are doing micro-enterprise training, internships, some of the things that you just suggested. Clearly, this is an area that requires and is fundamental to have government intervention. If you don't have the government intervention, it's very difficult to break through many of these things. So that's some of the kind of work that takes place. In terms of the, you were at the first part of your question speaking about, uses of alcohol and what that does. The only way to solve these problems is to talk about them a lot. At the same time, do some of the behavioral things that you were mentioning. And it is through cases that one can present what companies can do and just the whole of society, because many of these problems are behind closed doors. And as long as they stay there, they're not resolved. And I think this is the fundamental challenge that we all have. And certainly on all the measurement, it is the way to adapt policies quickly. Because today we have that possibility, is how quickly you can adapt policies and fine tune. And I think this is the area of public policy that needs to grow with the challenges.
I think if I can just add to that, because I'm also going to be leaving the stage in a minute to catch a flight. But one thing that we found when we go into the communities, there's a lot of fear by these women to actually express what's really going on in their lives. And we found that, as a corporation, we're not skilled necessarily to address all these issues by ourselves. We have to bring in experts in, the health field or psychology, in the NGOs, to sit side by side with us and to really do it without us in the room and understand what are the real barriers so we don't end up implementing the wrong solution that could have negative, because great intention sometimes has negative impacts. And so that's something just to tag off of what, President Moreno said over here, which is we have to make sure that we're really enabling these women to express their points of views in a safe environment, allow them to feel protected, give them the resources and those vehicles so that way they're not harmed for expressing that point of view and they can get the help that they need. And so that's the way that we try to do it, through those partnerships, because, I'd like to say that Coke could go in there, have the conversation, but that's not real. What's real is that we have to actually do it with people who they trust and who they feel they can open up to, and then we can maybe be an enabler and a partner. Thank you for having me here today. I'm sorry, I have to catch a flight, but this is great, so thank you.
So I just want to come in here on the issue of labor, and thank you, Anu. I could kiss you for the report so much. Just to talk about how labor operates. I come from a region, 90% in South Asia are in informal workforce. What is informal work? Informal work is where you don't have an employer. You don't have any surety. You don't have safe contracts. I would like to bring in another story after hearing so many examples of a construction worker, whom I will call Imrana. It was not even trafficking. The whole family decided to go as a lot worker to another state in the country. And she's living there, doing construction work, as is her husband. But for negotiation, she's also using transactional sex. If she goes to the police on the transactional sex piece, she loses her negotiational power. But with the laws that they are, actually, the lot master can report her to the police. So if we don't decriminalize, if we don't understand how informal sector works, how women workers especially in informal sector, deal with their every day of life, if we put the pressure of criminal law in their path, if we create greater obstacles, we're not helping anybody. We are creating greater victimization, we are creating greater silences, we are creating greater invisibility. And we can all be very comfortable not looking at that. But if we want to serve the cause of women, we need to look at where they are. And we need to hear what they want to say. I mean, exactly what Beatriz just said. She said, You have to listen to what the women are saying. And sometimes they say things we don't want to hear, we don't like to hear, we don't want to go to that solution. But who is going to lead that change? Is it going to be us because we think this is the right way? Or is it going to be the women who will decide when they will take that change? Are we going to increase the options and allow them to make that decision? Or are we going to take the decision for them? And that's going to fall flat on its face, as we can see. You know, we've seen when raid and rescue happens in informal sector labor, especially on trafficking, same person have been rescued 9 times. The same very woman, 9 times rescued, sent back, repatriated, runs away again. So what are we doing here? And we are allowing larger countries, I mean, coming from India, I mean, I know how that works. How Indian state would not like to take responsibility for these women who are poor, who can't be in their own countries, who are in the largest country in the region that can provide some employment, some security. And how do we support this? So how do we open the doors? How do we remove the barriers and listen to the voices that will come together? And how do we allow the organizations on the ground to guide us in that process? I think that is, you know, removing the curtains from our own eyes and removing the barriers and obstacles from in front of the women.
My name is Msimbi Kanyoram. I'm with the Global Fund for Women, where we believe that every woman should be free, should be powerful, and should be heard with no exception. So that means universal, every woman, wherever they are. I wanted to ask my question in terms of expressing first the thankfulness that we have so much data now coming out, and really to continue on that pathway of the data, while at the same time saying data is useful to help us make a difference, and data itself will not change the lives. But really what is going to make a change in the lives is the use of that data. So in connection with this, what I heard from the data that was given by McKinsey and the others, that what is needed for us to get that economic well-being is actually to change the whole ecosystem of things that make it uncomfortable or make violence against women an issue. Therefore, what can we do? I know a research was done recently by the Dutch government that actually shows that businesses are afraid to use the terminology of human rights. The groups that Tulika is speaking about actually approach this debate from the human rights perspective with the intention of having changes at the policy level, having changes that will affect many people, not just 10,000 girls, but the whole countries, changing the way that people think, etc. What could women's movements, women's funds, women's organizations, or women who have actually provided examples of what works help the businesses to think differently about human rights? Because the effort we are trying to do with win-win is partially that. And the examples we bring to life that have worked were, for example, when people like Ambassador Swani work with women who go into decision-making, they go into parliaments, and they bring all of the issues that we brought to the floor. Things like when women organize under organizations such as funds or Women Moving Millions to get resources directly for women to use in their work, etc. What can we do to create the bridges, to help create the bridges that show that what businesses are doing to change the economies will be even better when we use a framework of universal human rights for everybody, for the women on the ground, for everybody, for the children, etc. What can we do to create the bridges? There's a big gap between approaching things from the economic perspective and from the human rights perspective.
Can I attempt to answer that from a economic and corporate perspective? I think that you raise a really good point, and I think that the research that McKinsey has done and that Anu shared clearly shows the connection. I think your data speaks to the fact that there is that, link between the society and economy as well as the flourishing of the business. So I think that correlation is extremely important to bring to businesses, and I think it gives that rationale and logic behind why we need to be addressing human rights issues. I don't think that corporations are necessarily afraid of human rights issues. However, I do think that NGOs can frame the conversation in terms of the benefit to the businesses in addition to the benefit to society. And I think there's a way of doing that. Many of the examples that were shared really speaks to the win-win piece. I mean, if I talk about our employee population and our employee population who may have been victims of violence, and what that does to engagement, what that does to productivity, what that does to lost potential. These are things we don't want, because ultimately it impacts our bottom line when we have absenteeism. There was a study that was done in Chile where they saw that lost salaries were equivalent to $1.6 billion, which is about 2% of Chile's GDP. I mean, that is absolutely huge, and it clearly impacts our business. At Sodexo, we did a study, and why is that important? Because we know, and Bea spoke to it, we know that we need women to be successful. Ashley talked about, consumer spending. 75% of the decisions are made by women. What if you take that away from women? What impact does it have on the business? We did a study where we looked at what we call gender balanced teams. And gender balanced teams are defined as teams with 40 to 60% women. And on every single one of the indicators, we found that gender balanced teams outperform those that are not gender balanced. Employee engagement, financial performance, brand recognition, client retention, every single one. McKinsey, Credit Suisse, Catalyst, all of these have done that particular research. So I think making those linkages is really important. Approaching it from a human rights perspective, but making the linkage in terms of what that does to the organization will help to form those linkages and translate. And I think the study that was shared clearly begins to build that bridge and share those linkages.
Sadly, it's my role to wrap up the panel, but the good thing about having to cut off the discussion at this point is that we have some time now to have more informal conversations with one another and follow up on some of the themes that have been raised here. One theme that I wanted to throw out that I think is really a very positive development and area of work is the working upstream on prevention with the men who are not spending all of their money on alcohol and cigarettes and sex, of whom there are many, and reaching them at times in their lives when they are either in the deeply sort of fairness and justice-oriented age in sort of early adolescence, or at a time when they're making the transition to fatherhood, and how that tenderizes them and opens them to thinking more about gender equality. With that, I thank you all for being here and participating in this conversation, and I hope that we can continue discussing some of these themes in the coming minutes. Thank you.